Kevin, for that generous and eloquent introduction. And now I'll have to proceed with caution. And thanks to all of you for coming here on this Friday afternoon, summary day, last day of classes. I think that Professor Peltier should give you extra credit, for sure. You can quote me. Okay, it's conventional in these talks to describe the context in which this presentation was written as part of a larger project. But in fact, this isn't part of a larger project, at least not yet. I don't have any intention to really go anywhere else with this. But I will tell you where it came from, and it came from three sources. One, I was invited to a conference by the International Melville Society that was called Melville in the Mediterranean, and it was held in East Jerusalem this summer. Now you might wonder, Melville in the Mediterranean? I mean, there are no whales there. But in fact, Melville went to what was then called the Holy Land in the 1850s. I think he spent about a month there doing the general tour. And then when he got back, he spent 10 years writing this interminable epic called Clarel that was written in, it's longer than the Iliad, and it was written in iambic tetrameter, which means 8 syllables rather than 10, and all rhymed couplets. So it's very, very difficult and fascinating to read. So since I was invited to that conference and I was very interested in going to that region for another project, I realized that I had to catch up on my Melville and I had to read Clarel. So I taught a graduate course called Transnational Melville because, of course, the transnational is what all of my students and many of us are interested in. And we just read through Melville from beginning to end, not all of it, but most of it, and I made them read Clarel as well, for which I'm grateful. I'll only mention Clarel at the end, though. I won't inflict it on you. But the approach that we decided to take was, instead of just reading theories of the transnational today and try to then see how they would work out in Melville, we decided to use Melville himself as a theorist, that is, to read his fiction and poetry, to look at the way in which he was theorizing the transnational in the 19th century. Because the phenomenon that we think of as very modern as globalization, of course, has happened for many centuries before in different forms. So we wanted to use him as a guide rather than just impose a theory on him. And that gets me to my third introductory point, that methodologically, we were also responding to the sense among many critics that we're sort of tired with an old paradigm in which the critic goes to the literary text with what some people have called the hermeneutics of suspicion, to basically say, you don't know how you were embedded in these structures of power, and I, as critic, retrospectively, am going to show the blind spots that you yourself weren't aware of. Instead, we decided to see what Melville actually could make us aware of through his texts. Okay, so that's the base. So basically, what I'm saying is this grew out of a graduate course, and my students are very much a part of this paper. So I'll start with a quotation from a not very well-known novel of Herman Melville's called White Jacket, or The World and a Man of War, one of his seafaring novels about really the militarization of the Navy in that period from 1850. And this is the quotation: "We expatriate ourselves to nationalize with the universe." I'll repeat it. "We expatriate ourselves to nationalize with the universe." So proclaims the eponymous hero in a paean to the roving life of working sailors as he contemplates the stars from the masthead. This sentence put me in mind of the transnational turn in American studies and other disciplines today. The desire, especially on the part of U.S. Americanists, to expatriate our perspective, to place it outside the nation as a vantage point in order to seek a broader, perhaps even universal, framework for analysis in time and space. Some of those frameworks include the hemisphere, the continent, the planet, the Republic of Letters, deep time, the transatlantic, diaspora, critical internationalism, globalization, and so on. In the novel White Jacket, this rhapsodic moment is brought down to earth with a thud, as the narrator then explains. But when White Jacket speaks of the rover's life, he means not life in a man of war, which, with its martial formalities and thousand vices, stabs to the heart the soul of all free and easy honorable rovers. There's a tension throughout this novel between the universalizing impulse of expatriation with the representation of that subtitle, The World in a Man of War, a rigidly hierarchical world bound by violent differentiations and exclusions. Although the words nation and nationalize had different meanings in 1850 than they do today, I take this tension in White Jacket as evocative of a critical dilemma that we face today. How to square the sometimes dizzying border-crossing goals of transnational approaches with the past and present realities of the nation-state, its martial, political, economic, and social formalities and hierarchies, as Melville named them. Melville's work raises this question. If the nation is inadequate both as a framework for producing knowledge and as a mode of understanding and experiencing social belonging, then what other frameworks are available for representing the world and for imagining modes of sociality and collectivity that do not reproduce the violence and social hierarchies of the nation-state? In the opening quotation, White Jacket can only imagine his communing with the universe through the language of nationalizing, just as critics today have noticed that our own critical language of the transnational risks reproducing the structures of national power, imperial reaches, and the global systems of capitalism. So today I'd like to rove through Melville's work to explore how he posed some of these questions at a time when the nation-state itself was emerging as a unit for geopolitical organization of the world and for generating knowledge. It was not a universal form as it has become. His work affords us a critical perspective on both the power and the limits of the nation in a world increasingly interconnected by the vectors of trade, empire, and revolution. And I'll be covering three themes, or at least suggesting three themes. One is the transnational circulation of knowledge. Two, the retrospective construction of national histories. And three, the problem with which I started of representing and imagining non-national modes of collectivity. So let me start with Moby Dick, which I know many of you have read this semester. And I'll be looking at the circulation of knowledge and language across, outside, beneath national idioms. Melville is interested not only in travel as a way of gaining knowledge, as you know, but also as in tracking how knowledge itself travels. Moby Dick is well known for its encyclopedic massing of texts and tales. In the opening in etymology, the novel starts by mocking the notion that the origins, history, and transmission of language could be limited to national paradigms. The pale usher, as he's called, and I quote, was ever dusting his old lexicons and grammars with a queer handkerchief, mockingly embellished with all the gay flags of all the known nations of the world. So mocking this notion that somehow the flags of the nation would be a way of organizing this encyclopedic knowledge. In extracts, the sub-librarian, we're told, gleams his random extracts from the street stalls of the earth, collecting what has been promiscuously said, thought, fancied, and sung of the Leviathan by many nations and generations, including our own. Now this promiscuity, and that word promiscuity meant not simply sexual promiscuity, but kind of the overflowing of boundaries and the ignoring of borders. This promiscuity cannot be contained by national categories any more than whales can be classified by Linnaean taxonomies. Key sources of knowledge in the novel, of course, stem not only from books and literature, but from the traveling labor of sailors and whalers, from whom Ishmael learns to read the whale by spearing and cutting into it. While Melville exposes the incompleteness of systems and single sources of knowledge, books and scientific instruments, some systems of knowledge in the novel don't even translate as they travel, say from Queequeg's elders to the tattoos on his body to the copy on the coffin. And also, of course, remember that Queequeg comes from an unknown island that's not on any maps. So much knowledge then isn't officially recorded. It travels orally among seamen of different traditions and is only available in whispers, rumors, and tall tales. We learn, for example, about Ahab's scar from multiple sources, from the prophecy of Elijah, the economic interests of the Quaker ship owners, an old gay-head Indian, and a gray Manxman. And he's described as an old sepulchral man, who had never yet laid eyes on Ahab yet, and I quote, "The old sea traditions, the imperial credulities, popularly invested this old Manxman with preternatural powers of discernment, so that no white sailor seriously contradicted him." So even here, that knowledge is embodied in this older man's knowledge, but also it's limited and tracked by race too, because even though he gives one explanation for the scar, another explanation is given, a really opposing explanation, by members of the gay-head Indians who do contradict the Manxman with a different story about his scar and coming from their own sources of knowledge. Now, one of the most interesting examples of the transnational circuits of knowledge in Moby Dick can be found in chapter 54, called "The Town Ho," in parentheses, "as told at the Golden Inn." And this is a chapter that occurs after the introduction of the gam, a word Ishmael claims does not exist in dictionaries, which refers to the meeting of ships on the open seas. Not only whalers, but also slavers, pirates, merchant marines, and men-of-wars, they meet and they do these gams, that is, board one another's ship, in order to exchange information, mail, and sociability. And I'll just mention that if you do look up gam in the OED, the first example you'll find of it is from Moby Dick. This story, which has been seen by many critics, as a particularly literary form of knowledge, because if you remember, it foreshadows and parallels the main story. But the story itself arrives on the Pequod during a brief gam on the ocean crossroads of Cape Hope, which are described as much like some noted four corners of a great highway where you meet more travelers than in any other parts. There, the Pequod meets the town Ho, I quote, "manned almost wholly by Polynesians, while the story was the private property of 3 Confederate white seamen. Then one told it to Tashtigo, remember the gay-head harpooner, and swore him to secrecy. But Tashtigo mumbled so much of it in his sleep that his fellow sailors forced him to tell all upon waking. The uncanny nature of the story, which involves the white whale, leads the sailors on the Pequod to keep it from Ahab and all the other officers. So knowledge here, this story from the town Ho, crosses oceans, ships, and races through the channels of class hierarchy. But Ishmael decides then when he tells it on interweaving this darker thread with the story as publicly narrated on the ship. So when he tells us the story in the text, he theatrically chooses to preserve the style in which I once narrated it at Lima to a lounging circle of my Spanish friends, that is, cavaliers who interrupt him with questions and offers of drink. So it's very interesting that the story is so highly mediated. You know, it comes from these stories on board the ship and someone talking in their sleep, and then mediated through this performance in Lima. So these mediations are what I'm referring to as the international circulation of knowledge. Now the story, if you recall, is about part successful but ultimately thwarted mutiny, led by a kind of noble wild man called Steelkilt, who is mistreated by a jealous, cowardly mate, Radney, who then meets his justice in the jaws of Moby Dick. What interests me is both the source of the tale and the context of its telling. Ishmael goes on at length to identify Steelkilt through his local roots. That is, he doesn't call him an American, but he calls him a lake man from the shores of Erie, a canaler from the wilds of upstate New York, where a kind of primitive manliness thrives. He says, "There howl your true Ashantis." And Ishmael plays up these characteristics in response to the questions of the Lima Dons, who never heard of the place. So Ishmael then recasts the Great Lakes as the landlocked heart of America, which he compares in their economic function and geographic grandeur to Polynesian waters, the Atlantic Ocean, the African shores of the Mediterranean, thus turning the inland into a global waterway. The Lima men are amazed by both the landscape and the passions evinced there, as they exclaim, "No need to travel, the world's one Lima," through which Melville, I think, suggests the kind of provincialism of universalizing, of generalizing. And they had previously thought, and I quote, that at your temperate north, the generations were cold and holy as the hills. When they question Ishmael about the truthfulness of the story, he swears on the Bible that he trod the ship and talked to Steelkilt directly, even though he ends the story by saying that none knew of his whereabouts. Now, this story of revolt traverses nations and races in its content and its retelling. Its official public unveiling, though, according to Ishmael, performs racialized national identities in stark contrast to one another. So even though these stories circulate through so many different contexts, when he performs them, in some sense, they yield certain kind of fixed stereotypes. Steelkilt is never called an American, as I mentioned, but a Canaler and Lakeman. But Ishmael's retelling asserts a kind of rugged North American frontier heroism against the stereotypically Spanish-American fop in ruffled sleeves. Ishmael's claim to a direct, unmediated knowledge is highly mediated through the circuits of race, empire, and class in an international arena. Knowledge that circulates promiscuously among races and across continents and oceans can be performed in highly nationalist and racialized structures that construct a knowledge of what was thought then of national character. Melville, in this case, reveals both the performative power of national utterances and their reliance on international narratives, as he does in his well-known description of the global division of labor on board the Pequod. In chapter 27, Knights and Squires, after describing the three mates from Nantucket, Cape Cod, and Martha's Vineyard, and then their harpooneers, laborers from 3 continents, Tashtigo, an Indian from Gay Head, and Dago from the coast of Africa, and of course Queequeg from a Pacific island, the narrator summarizes this way. As for the residue of the Pequod's company, be it said that at the present day, not 1 in 2 of the many thousand men before the mast in the American whale industry are Americans born, though pretty nearly all the officers are. Herein, it is the same with the American whale fishery, as with the American army and military and merchant navies, and the engineering forces employed in the construction of the American canals and railroads. The same, I say, because in all these cases, the Native American, and what he means by that is the white Americans, liberally provides the brains, the rest of the world as generously supplying the muscles. So there's no national entity in this description. That is, he doesn't use the word America to name the nation, but rather an adjective and persons American. This identity emerges then, this American identity, he shows, from a global division of labor to create the material wealth and enact the martial formalities, the political power that would be coterminous with the nation. Now the narrator goes on to another famous statement about the appeal for equality. I'm sure you remember this one. He refers to each islander, each isolado living on a separate continent of his own, yet now federated along one keel. An Anarcassus Klutz deputation from all the isles of the sea and the ends of the earth, accompanying old Ahab in the Pequod to lay the world's grievances before that bar from which not very many of them ever come back. Might these grievances, then, be those of a global working force which has created the wealth claimed by the so-called native brain that would constitute the nation? And I should say that in my class, one of the critics that we did read was C.L.R. James, who wrote a book about Melville, and that really is in his reading, in some sense, of the crew of the Pequod. In many of Melville's works, the problem of knowledge and ignorance is related to grief and grievance, the source of so many misrecognized, aborted, or thwarted revolts. Revolutions that are recognized historically, that become known, tend to be those linked to national independence. Hence the unknown or misrecognized nature of the slave revolt, let's say, in Benito Cereno, a revolt that evokes and has been what has been called the disavowed modernity of the Haitian Revolution. In his less well-known novel, ostensibly about the American Revolution, Israel Potter, His 50 Years of Exile, Melville anatomized the way in which national narratives are constructed retrospectively out of chaotic memories of local and transnational violence. And I'll give a little sense of the novel as I go along. So now I'm turning to my second point about the way in which national narratives are retrospectively constructed. And this was a novel written in 1855, a historical novel about the American Revolution. You'll see why I hesitate. The book opens with a conventional preface of a found manuscript, a tattered biography we read forlornly published on sleazy gray paper, which the author touched up after it was rescued by the merest chance by rag pickers. Now, this introduction Melville comically dedicates to His Highness the Bunker Hill Monument, and he spells His Highness Highnness. The ostensible, because it was a tall monument, the ostensible purpose of the narrative is to restore Potter, that is the protagonist of the novel, as one of the forgotten privates of the Bunker Hill battle to his national birthright by expanding his biography like a dilapidated old tombstone retouched. Yet the story of Potter's life is narrated in a way that links him more to rag-picking than to national narratives of origins established in retrospect by monuments. Rags describe the clothing Potter wears for most of his life in dismal poverty in London. As his recorded life becomes a rag, it returns to the international source of industrial papermaking, so ghoulishly depicted in the story The Tartarus of Maids, where rags pour into the machine from the country roundabout, some from far oversea, Leghorn and London. Israel Potter's participation in a war which the text never names appears as a random series of events. And it's hard to summarize this novel because it doesn't really have a narrative. It's almost picaresque, that is, he moves from scene to scene. He just happens to make it to the battle after finishing his plowing. His career as a soldier during the battle barely fills a page, after which, by a series of Forrest Gump-like coincidences, and that's the only analogy I can think of. He's like Forrest Gump. He just happens to appear at all the right moments in history. He escapes from a British ship, meets Benjamin Franklin in Paris, meets King George in his garden, and after a series of impressments on both sides, he sails with Paul Jones. He spends the rest of his life then destitute in London, as the narrator summarizes. Thus, repeatedly and rapidly, were the fortunes of our wanderer planted, torn up, transplanted, and dropped again hither and thither. So not much of a narrative. I want to make 2 points about this book. One is the mutability and final irrelevance of nation in Potter's life during and after the war. And 2 is how Melville shows that the narrative of national independence is retrospectively constructed. In the sections describing Israel's youth, he makes us aware that when when people are fighting in the middle of the war, often the war isn't yet named. So it's not clear, given that you don't know the outcome, whether only later do we know that this was the War of American Independence, right? What if the British had won? What would have been the name of that then? Like some kind of revolt of the Americas? So in other words, that at the moment that it's happening, there is really no national frame in which to understand that war. Only later does that become clear. So and it's remarkable the way in which Melville really gives you that sense of the momentary and the retrospective. In the sections describing Israel's youth, the narrator repeats a verbal construction in which he repeats several times. So he'll say, Israel is said to do X, little thinking the day would come when Y would happen. So for example, and he happens to have gone on a whaling ship as well. So he got around, Israel Potter. So we read that while on board a whaler, darting his whale lance, he was unwittingly preparing himself for the Bunker Hill rifle. His participation in what would become later known as the War of Independence or the American Revolution has no narrative inevitability in the text and no intentionality on his part. It's always something he doesn't know that will come later. The narrator doesn't describe the Bunker Hill battle, not only because to readers in the present it was so well known, but also because in the midst of war, its ultimate significance was unclear. Potter could easily have been British or American. And chapter 14 is entitled this way, in which Israel is a sailor under 2 flags and 3 ships and all in one night. When he is impressed into the British Navy, he protests, I'm no Englishman, And his jailers respond, "That's the old story. There's no Englishmen in the English fleet, all foreigners." So that there's nothing kind of inevitable and fixed about the national identity of men in a fighting force, and in this case, the Navy. Even the historical figures he meets have no particular national character. Benjamin Franklin appears as an eccentric cosmopolitan in Paris rather than as a founding father. King George is a kindly old man. And Paul Jones, who is described as a disinherited Indian chief in European clothes, refers to himself as an untrammeled citizen and sailor of the universe. In the sea battle, recognized as the first major one of the war, Melville describes the carnage in greater and gorier details than the monumentalized Bunker Hill, to conclude that the enormity of death and destruction showed, and I quote, that the belligerents were no longer, in the ordinary sense of things, an English ship and an American ship, so that the carnage of war makes those distinctions impossible to hold on to. It's really only in the later monumentalizing narratives of the nation do these identities become clear. The book ends with Potter as an old man returning home to die, but it questions the meaning of a nation as a home. Home for him is not the Boston. When he arrives in Boston and there's this triumphal procession on, lo and behold, July 4th, right? But what happens is this triumphal cart proclaiming July 4th almost runs him over. But instead he returns to the mountain ruins of his youth. But instead of finding his old farmstead, he just finds a bemossed stone jam plowed under a new field. Similarly, his appeal for a government pension is never granted. Thus, the knowledge of his transatlantic biography, which is rescued from rag pickers, never restores him to his national birthright. Instead, it deconstructs that narrative of nation as birthright and shows its spectral reconstruction out of gravestones and silent monuments. Now, for another example of this problem of national narratives, I'm going to turn to Melville's last work that was posthumously published, Billy Budd Sailor, that, well, there were so many different forms of it that at one point it had the subtitle An Inside Narrative. Now, Billy Budd, did you do that in your class? Oh, okay. It's also set in the transatlantic revolutionary era, and it's also beset by the problem of knowing the tangled histories of revolution and counter-revolution, which are not contained by national narratives. And so this is another case in which Melville is always interested in even though, he's so wordy and accumulates so many references, he's always interested in kind of the unrecorded and what goes beneath, what's not in the libraries and what goes beneath the radar of official narratives. Like the unrecorded definition of GAM, the town hotel, and the book rescued from rag pickers, the inside narrative of the Bella Potent, the name of the ship in this case, is contrasted with national narratives and official monuments. The narrator, and this too is a story, it occurred to me in this reading of Melville that in my course that so many of his novels and stories are about thwarted or aborted revolutions. And this one also, the narrator evokes the historical setting. This one is set during the Revolutionary era by reference to the great anxiety on the part of ship authorities. And here he's referring to historical events that in the British Navy, it takes place in the British Navy, that provoked by recent mutinies on the ships called the Spithead and the Nore. These mutinies that were suppressed, as he says, but yet left lingering discontent among common sailors of the British Navy. The sailors were neither fully absolved nor content, according to the narrator, until the insurrectionary energy of these mutinies were dissipated in Nelson's battles of the Nile and Trafalgar. Imperial warfare that quelled class struggles within the Navy. But the narrator points out that in British naval history, even though we can read, obviously, about Nelson's battles and Trafalgar and so on, these mutinies received less a narration than a reference, and their account can't be found in libraries. And then, I quote, "Like some events in every age befalling states everywhere, including America, the Great Mutiny was of such character that national pride, along with views of policy, would fain shade it off into the historical backgrounds." Thus, the story of Billy Budd is implicitly aligned with those mutinies not found in history books. And as we later read that Captain Vere did not survive to fight in the Nile and Trafalgar, the events of the narrative are placed in this uneasy hiatus between class mutiny and imperial reconciliation. And I'll give you just a brief plot summary of Billy Budd. God, it's hard to summarize. Okay, so Billy Budd is this kind of beautiful, young, innocent sailor who has a stutter. And there's an officer on ship, Claggart, who's very envious and contemptuous of Billy Budd, and teases him and provokes him and bullies him to the point at which Captain Vere, the captain of the ship, calls them both into his, I guess it's not his office, but his cabin, and tries to find out what's going on. Am I getting this right? Yeah. And basically, Billy Budd, out of his frustration, and he can't really speak, he lashes out and he punches Claggart, and Claggart dies. And Captain Vere, who very much loves Billy like everyone else does, feels that in order to assert his authority, he has to quickly hang Billy. So he, rather than wait till they get to shore and have a trial, that he has to reassert order on the ship by hanging Billy. So it's an amazing story that's been open to a lot of interpretations, and I won't go into them. I just wanted you to know the basic outlines. So you can see how, even though it's not about an overt mutiny, it's about the threat of mutiny, that this young, charismatic sailor could possibly lead some kind of revolt. Throughout the story of Billy Budd, we are made aware that knowledge of the once impending threat of transatlantic revolt is not available in history books. So what I'm arguing is, even though Billy Budd is not about a mutiny, that it's set in this context of transatlantic revolutions that is going on all over. The narrator claims that the Revolutionary era, and I don't just mean the American Revolution, but the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. The narrator claims that the Revolutionary era, in which England was confronted by the din and dust of the fallen Bastille, appears measurably clear to us who look back at it and read it. But then he goes on to say, but to the grandfathers of us graybeards, that is, to the men who actually lived through that revolutionary period, quote, the world was eclipsing menace and mysterious and prodigious. Not America was exempt from apprehension. At the height of Napoleon's unexampled conquests, there were Americans who fought at Bunker Hill, who looked forward to the possibility that the Atlantic might prove no barrier against the ultimate schemes of this French portentous upstart from the revolutionary chaos, who seemed in the act of fulfilling judgment prefigured in the apocalypse. So this sense of impending doom and apocalyptic revolution. The narrator offers this evaluation in conjecturing that Claggart, the man who's killed, may have all along, with many others, may have joined the Navy from a debtor's jail. And the source of this speculation is a most interesting talk on the terrace of Greenwich with a Baltimore Negro, a Trafalgar man. He told the narrator that a warship short of hands at the time would be filled by drafts culled direct from the jails. So there are 2 points I want to make about that. One, that the threat represented in the wake of the French Revolution both impelled the need for more men to be impressed in the British fleet, and the same insatiate demand for men made discontent and mutiny more likely. And I also wanted to point out something about the way the story is constructed. Like other examples I've mentioned, that the narrator gets his information from all these different sources, like in this case, this talk on the porch of Trafalgar Man. So he's collecting these different sources from all over the world. To know the inside narrative of a single event means to go beyond imperial histories and national libraries, to conversations with unnamed sailors of unspecified national origins, to establish a context of mutinies, empty jails, and soldiers on Bunker Hill longing to unite with the revolution across the Atlantic. Now, after Billy is hanged, his story is retold twice. One from a naval chronicle of the time called News from the Mediterranean. A story based, we're told, partly on rumor in what the narrator calls publication now long superannuated and forgotten. And he says that before the narrator's tale, it was all that hitherto stood in human record to attest what manner of men, respectively, were John Claggart and Billy Budd. So what he does is he tells us, then he quotes the story as though it were from a newspaper, that is the official naval newspaper called News from the Mediterranean. And it's told from the perspective of the Imperial Navy, and it's the exact opposite tale from Melville. So you kind of wonder if this was all of the remaining knowledge the conceit is that this was his archive. He used this story and that's all that he had to go on. Then how did he tell the exact opposite story than the official one? And in this official story, the criminal is clearly Billy. And he is described as one of those aliens adopting English cognomens. And the murdered Claggart is described as respectable, responsible, with a strong patriotic impulse. So their characters are completely reversed. But this long-forgotten account is followed in the story by a more memorable one. Instead of this imperial narrative achieving a kind of monumental status, the spar from which the foretopman, that is Billy was a foretopman, was suspended, was converted into a monument and was for some few years kept trace of by the bluejackets. And I continue to quote, their knowledges, and I found that plural very interesting, their knowledges followed it from ship to dockyard and again from dockyard to ship, still pursuing it even when at last reduced to a mere dockyard boom. So that this spar on which he was hanged, that became a monument, like an informal monument that the sailors passed from one to another at different docks as they sailed. And it's telling that Melville uses the unusual plural knowledges. Though the narrator sees these bluejackets as ignorant of the secret facts that he possesses, their impression of Billy is actually closer to his than to this news from the Mediterranean. And it leads to what he calls the rude utterance of another sailor, who with artless temperament made some lines which, after circulating among the shipboard crews for a while, finally got rudely printed at Portsmouth as a ballad. Now this ballad is named Billy and the Derbies, and it is the final word of the story, so the story ends with this ballad, and it's been assumed to be the source or the beginning of Melville's tale. So to return to that, my first theme about the international circulation of knowledge, that Melville thereby validates these multiple knowledges of international and potentially mutinous sailors and laborers, whose knowledges circulate beneath the decks and around the world through the routes of empire and revolution. And now I turn to my third and last point with some speculative ideas about that long epic poem, Clarel, because that poem is also engaged, and I can tell you more about it later if you're interested, is also engaged in imagining communities and ways of knowing history that go beyond the framework of single nation. I'll just give you, I can't give you a summary, but I'll give you the basic framework. That is, the conceit of it is that Clarel is a theological student of theology in New England, and he's having a crisis of faith. So he goes to the Holy Land to see if he can find kind of faith renewed and faith embodiment in the actual sites of the biblical stories. And along the way, basically what he encounters is disillusionment after disillusionment, but it becomes like the Canterbury Tales, where all along the way he meets other characters who tell different stories, and it goes on and on and on and on. But I think that one of the things it's interested in is imagining these different kinds of communities around faith, around ethnicity, around nation, and so on. And I'd like to just show a tension between two ways of representing the landscape in Clarel, which involve different ways of knowing history and different ways of imagining human interrelatedness. One, we could say, is vertical. We might call it archaeological, representing the buried striations of violent historical change. And the other is a historical axis through which multiple people circulate and exchange language, customs, and culture. In Clarel, as in the other works I've discussed today, Melville rejects master narratives. That is, whether that narrative is one of biblical revelation, of progress, of national revolution. What unites the pilgrims is a sense throughout Clarel of being suspended at a moment of convulsive change, where their own relation to the past and future is unclear. So for my first example, in the first book, Clarel rambles through Jerusalem, and his rambles are described this way, and we see a word that I started with, that is the notion of roving, or the rover. And I'll just cite a quote from the poem. They rove the storied grounds, tread many a sight that rues the ban, where serial wrecks on wrecks confounds, era and monuments and man, or rather in stratifying way, bed and impact and overlay. Imagine reading a whole book that sounds like that. Now, storied, that is, they rove the storied ground, has a double meaning, of course. The ground contains tales from the past, whose tracers are layered in stories. Like Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, here Clarel looks back at the piling wreckage through which discrete periods in monumental histories cannot be distinguished as they are violently embedded and overlaid into one another. And the storied ground here is silent. It does not speak. And I'd like to just contrast this to a later passage in which Rolfe describes a character who's a trader, a merchant from the Isle of Lesbos, who's committed to a kind of revelry. And he's like one of the characters in this Chaucer-like pilgrimage. It's a sight-long quotation about this guy. A true child of the lax Levant, that polyglot and loose-laced mother, in such variety he's lived, where creeds dovetail into each other. Such influences he's received, thrown among all, Medes, Elamites, Egyptians, Jews, and proselytes. Just imagine how Melville had to work on these rhymes. Strangers from Rome and men of Crete and parts of Libya, round Cyrene, Arabians and the throngs ye meet, on Smyrna's quays and all between, Stamboul and Fez thrown among these, a caterer to revelries. He's caught the tints of many a scene, and so become a harlequin, gay patchwork of all levities, holding to now, swearing by here. Now, this is a very different view of history and of human sociability, human collectivity from the wreck piled on wreck, in which silent fragments of remains are crushed into one another. This, what he calls Polyglot World, represents an extraordinary interaction of peoples and cultures as they circulate throughout the cities of the Levant. Though somewhat dismissed as a light-hearted offspring of a promiscuous mother, that is the polyglot and loose-laced mother. He uses this interesting phrase, the creeds dovetail into each other. This dovetailing of creeds into each other creates a gay patchwork like Queequeg and Ishmael's counterpane in Moby Dick. So Clarel offers us these two different views, a history of wrecks stratified, embedded in one another, and a here and now of polyglot promiscuity. These seemingly irreconcilable views evoke the critical dilemma with which we began, nationalizing with the universe versus the layers of historical violence exercised by national, imperial, and religious powers. From Melville, we learn, at least, that transnational approaches to literature and history must account for both. Expatriation, border crossing, cosmopolitanism on the one hand, as well as colonial violence, empire building, and the bloodshed of revolutions and counter-revolutions on the other. In conclusion, then, in the first decade of the 21st century, we often hear that catastrophe or shared vulnerability is a way of expatriating ourselves, that is, of taking ourselves outside our national limits and universalizing ourselves or connecting with others, that is, through catastrophe or shared vulnerability. That is, 9/11 and Katrina have exposed the illusion of national sovereignty, or the threat of environmental catastrophe should make us feel part of a global community with a shared concern for the planet. I'm just repeating some ideas you might have heard as well. And Melville has thought these thoughts before us. Are all his motley crew of mariners, renegades, and castaways federated along the keel of destruction? Or do they represent other democratic potentialities? And I'll just end by referring to one more work of Melville's called the N Cantatas, which take place on the Galapagos, where Charles Darwin famously traveled as well. In one of the tales there, he mocks the republic that develops on Charles Island, it's called. And in a way, what he's mocking too is these like Rousseau-like narratives of, and Hobbes, like, imagine the origins of human society, what happens, how we emerge from nature into society and into government arrangements. So in Charles Island, the monarch was cast out, and I quote, and the insurgents had confederated themselves, and that word that Melville uses often, confederating themselves, into a democracy neither Grecian, Roman, nor American. Nay, it was no democracy at all, but a permanent riotocracy, which gloried in having no law, but lawlessness. Yet this lawlessness bespeaks other kinds of confederating. For example, on this island, any fugitive would be welcome. And in that era, that would refer to the fugitive, the runaway tar, that is sailors who ran away from abusive captains as well as perhaps runaway slaves. And each runaway tar would be installed as ragged citizen of this universal nation. So in conclusion, I'll just end with a kind of question, that is, or a suggestion. A transnational approach to literature and culture must propose alternatives to global catastrophe to imagine such future modes of confederating and ways in which we might expatriate ourselves if we wish to nationalize with the universe. Thank you.